I think this last summer, I sensed that there was a sort of an unease in Iowa City. People were watching the rivers. People were watching the Iowa River, the Cedar River, the Des Moines, all big rivers with big watersheds that had the potential of producing big floods. All of them were flowing pretty much at bank level through much of the summer. And if you combine that flowing at bank level with some of the statistics, some of the information we now have, for example, every year for the last 20 years, Iowa has had a presidential declaration for floods, one county or more, every year for the last 20 years. The floods of 2008 were our largest natural disaster ever in Iowa. And in recent years, Iowa has had the third most expensive damage, the third largest damage from flooding of any state in the Union. We're third after, guess what? Mississippi, Alabama, Iowa. Flooding is a big deal in Iowa. We've heard it in the newspaper. Flooding is the new norm, the new normal. People seem to be adjusting very rapidly to the fact that we're going to continue to flood. The National Weather Service this last summer predicted that we would have flooding that was the most severe we have ever had here. The flood predictions were more extreme than any previous flood years using the same computer models. They were more extreme even than 2008. We simply lucked out this last summer. We lucked out because we didn't have those intense rains falling in the watershed in just the right area at just the right place. Other places in Iowa didn't have such a lucky year. 2010 was indeed a flood year for Iowa. Rivers in central Iowa and western Iowa, several cities there had the largest floods they've ever had on record. So we don't know what the total damage is yet, but we know that it was another flood year. So we look at 1993, 2008, 2010. We look at the weather predictions, the climate change predictions, and we say, what exactly is happening in Iowa? I'm not sure I can tell you this, but I can tell you that the publication of this book, Watershed Year, was quite amazing. It was published in March of this year, 3 months before people started to think about 2010 as being another severe flood year. And as a result of that, I think out of fear, there's been quite a bit of interest in the book. And there have been flood symposia that have been organized by the Regents institutions and by other organizations like the Rebuild Iowa office and NRCS and other offices across the state. We've had 10, well, we've had 7 so far. By a few weeks from now, we will have had 10 flood symposia across the state going to different communities, speakers from the Regents institutions going and telling people about flooding and trying to discuss flooding with them and what can you do to get ready for the future. How can people think differently? How can people learn to live with floods, if indeed that's the prediction in the future for Iowa? I learned a lot by doing this book. I'm not a flood expert by any means. I'm an ecologist by training. So I learned a lot. When I did the book, I thought that I was done once I finished the book. And I'll tell you, I've learned as much probably in the last 6 months, which feels like 6 years to me, as much in the last 6 months as I did learning, doing the book itself. So what I'd like to do tonight is do a talk that I couldn't have done when the book first came out and Sarah first called me. I couldn't have done this 6 months ago because I didn't know what I know now. But I'd like to combine the kinds of research that we're doing on climate change, what we're figuring out about climate change, with information on landscape alteration, and also looking at the science of flooding itself, which is a very complex subject, and combine those topics in my talk tonight. So first, before I start, just a very brief introduction to Watershed Year. If you haven't looked at it, I think that anyone in this room would enjoy looking at it. It's a book that is written for the landscape managers and policymakers and the like, but it's really a book written for the general public. Short chapters, lots of graphics. My ideal of writing is you read a chapter kind of like a hot knife slipping through butter without any work whatsoever, and people have told me that, you know, they can read this late at night. Even my son said that he stayed up late reading it. That was, I think, about the nicest compliment I've ever gotten from any of my kids about anything. So it's a book that's accessible. It's quite diverse. There are 25 chapters in it covering a diversity of subjects, but all relating to the science of the floods of 2008. However, it's not limited to that flooding. It could have easily been titled Flooding in the Corn Belt, because the floods across the Corn Belt have certain traits, and those are the traits that are discussed in this book. So let's talk about floods in Iowa. If we talk about floods in Iowa, we really need to begin with talking about the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. This is the ecosystem that covered 80% of Iowa for about the last 9,000 years in some areas of Iowa. This is the ecosystem that produced 25% of the world's grade A topsoils. That's what Iowa has. We are truly blessed in terms of the soils that we have. 25% of the best topsoils in the world right here, thanks to this tallgrass prairie. And the prairie was a miracle in terms of what it did for the land. In terms of ecosystem services, the ecosystem services are the things that nature gives us every day without us saying please or thank you. The tallgrass prairie gave us many things, biodiversity, clean air, clean water, lots and lots of different things, but in particular our soils, the soils that define our culture and our economy. But the prairie was really the gold standard of water management services. The prairie managed water like no other ecosystem, I think, on this continent could have done, both in terms of water retention, hanging on to the water. The prairie was kind of like a magnet, a greedy, set of greedy hands that didn't want to let the water loose. It held on to it in a big way, and that meant flood resistance. You've probably heard that prairies were like a gigantic sponge. And also in terms of water purification. The waters of Iowa ran crystalline clear prior to settlement. There was no water pollution, did not exist. And you can understand that if we just very briefly trace a water droplet from that, let's trace a bunch of water. Let's trace a rainstorm falling on those prairie grasses and forbs, prairie flowers. A lot of the water would have fallen on the plants, and before it even got down to the ground surface, it would have evaporated back into the sky. If it did get down to the ground surface, it wouldn't have been able to run over the surface the way water does now, because the thatch covering the ground surface was so very thick. The relatively small amount of water that got into the soil was held by the soil. It was held by an average of 16 inches across the state. That's average, 16 inches of topsoil. That was half air. It was indeed like a big sponge. And the amount of air in the amount of kind of air bubbles in the soil meant that the prairie could hold tremendous amounts of water. And if some of the water happened to trickle through the soil, it did so very slowly, very reluctantly, and it eventually came out in seeps in the valley bottoms. A lot of the valleys didn't have actual rivers. They just had these slow-moving seeps. So crystalline clear water, not a whole lot of flooding, not a whole lot of shedding of water once the rainstorm fell onto the land. This changed very rapidly. We have a little bit of a problem here in that the bottom line is cut off, but that's okay. I can read it to you, no problem. The prairie was transformed into our agricultural landscape. It was a rapid landscape transformation, and in this transformation, many of the prairie's ecosystem services were decreased or lost. This transformation from one of the most complex and diverse ecosystems, biomes in the country, on the continent, to one of the most highly engineered landscapes has been called the most rapid and complete ecological transformation in the history of the Earth. It happened in less than a single generation. And today what we have is 2/3 of Iowa being covered by 2 species rather than the 1,000 species of plants, many thousands of species of plants and animals of the prairie. We have 2/3 of Iowa being covered, farmers hope, by 2 species, corn and soybeans. The kind of dark gray patchwork quilt up there is an aerial photo of Pocahontas County, where something like 92% of the land surface is covered by corn and soybeans, and the rest is just this patchwork of roads and a few little homesteads here and there. So what you have by this, as a result of this transformation, is a modern hydrology that's totally altered from its original state, and the land now, instead of infiltrating, instead of restraining water, the land is engineered to shed water so that people can grow crops, which is why we're here. How is that done? I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I'm not blaming the original farmers, but I think we've gone a little bit too far. That's the main theme that I've written about in my books, and it's what I firmly believe. This is done by tiling the land. Tiles, do all of you know, does anybody know what a tile is? A few people. Okay, most of you do. So I won't explain them. I won't explain that the tiles have these perforations and the water comes down, collects in these pipes. It's always seemed kind of like a miracle to me that the water happens to find these little holes in the plastic pipes, but it does, and it's shed rapidly into ditches, which are dug into the ground to accept these ditches. This started in about the 1870s. We're still doing a lot of tiling today, an immense amount of tiling, actually, if you drive through the countryside. And about a third of Iowa cropland is now tiled, which means that water that goes into the soil, instead of moving very slowly and reluctantly, is shot extremely rapidly into the nearest drainage, which means if you have a lot of rain, a lot of water coming in, that drainage goes up and down, and we have flashy streams. But also, at some point, the tiles are running full. And people say, well, the tiles caused the floods of 2008. And what I've been told is, no, that's not true, because the tiles had been running full all spring. You know, they had been shooting all this water in, which is why the streams were running at or above bank level already when we had our big floods. At that point, the water cannot get into the soil. The soil is saturated, and it runs off the surface. And that means that during this time when the soil is saturated, we have tremendous erosion, and almost incredible. In 2008, we had in some sites 50 tons of acre per day. Now, these are selected sites. This is a few sites, but it did happen. The maximum allowable erosion for Iowa is supposed to be 5 tons per acre per year. So we had in one day 10 times as much as you're supposed to have in the entire year. And that means that you don't only have silt running into the drainages, but you also have a flush of pollution, nitrates and phosphates going into the Gulf of Mexico, causing the dead zone down there. And what is the result of all of this? Shedding of water, this engineered landscape. Well, the result of landscape alteration, if we look at the Raccoon River, which regularly floods Des Moines, right? That's what causes Des Moines floods, one of the two rivers, is an increase in annual river discharge. And this has been traced in rivers across Iowa. If you look at the discharge here, if I can find my pen, here it is. You can see that we started out in 1927 with an annual discharge average annual discharge below 1,000 cubic feet per second, and now we are up around 2,000 cubic feet per second, average annual discharge in one river, meaning that river now carries twice as much water, a little bit more than twice, on average every year.